right. Welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall, a periodic guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research. In today's final researcher salon from the Summer of Protocols 23 cohort, we'll be speaking with Sarah Friend about her Summer of Protocols research project titled Good Death. There will be a link to the Summer of Protocols forum in the YouTube chat where we can host conversation during the salon, in addition to readings of the week and other protocol musings. Our next town hall will be a guest talk on Wednesday, May 29th with Daniel Bashir. You can find more about Summer Protocols, the SOP research, the program calendar, and more information about the protocol kit at summerofprotocols.com. And so with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Venkat to introduce our speaker today. Venkat.
All right. Thought I'd actually share. Sarah's website here because I always find it really hard to introduce artists since I'm mostly a writer of fairly straightforward nonfiction. It's hard to introduce artists, but yeah, Sarah is an artist based out of Berlin. This is her website. I think it's isthisA.com. It's a reference to the Is This a Meme? And as you can see, she's done a variety of things. And I think the overarching theme is kind of like being at the forefront of digital technologies, whether it's NFTs or VR and whatever the latest digital media are, and kind of exploring themes like life and death as it plays out in those media. And I think that I saw that in some of your earlier work as well. But the Summer Protocols project Sarah did last year was exploring basically digital death and its relations to biological death. And a couple of connections I want to draw out. First, of course, there's things like AI agents that live and die. There's like avatars that you might have in gaming worlds that might live and die. The worlds themselves might live and die. And also, the one of the themes I think interested us most is we were thinking a lot about the Ethereum ecosystem and ossification, and should protocols like Ethereum themselves uh, be thought of as having life and death cycles, or are they eternal constructs? So we specifically wanted somebody to like look at those issues philosophically, and Sarah turned out to kind of bring the perfect mix of, I guess, artistic perspectives on a topic as well as philosophical perspectives. So that's what we're going to hear about today. Like, how do you think about death in the context of both um, humans themselves as biological beings, but also being part of these digital worlds? So over to you, Sarah. Screen.
Thank you, Venkat, for that introduction. And yeah, it's my pleasure to share a little bit more about the Summer of Protocols research. This is the first time any of it has really been presented, so this is very exciting. And also, I cannot believe I'm last, though I suppose that's fitting for the subject of death. All right, so I first started with this research or becoming interested in this subject when I learned about the phenomenon of MMO deaths. MMOs, if you're not familiar with the term, stands for Massively Multiplayer Online. It's shortened from MMORPG, which stands for Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game. Sometimes these worlds are shut down, though. They've been inhabited by many people, but for a variety of reasons, they can't continue forever, which can lead to these sort of planned public apocalypse events. And I listened to a podcast about one of them, and I watched the stream available online of that world ending. And I found it a very interesting phenomenon. I kept thinking about it. And secondly, I am the creator of a digital pet project called Lifeforms. Life forms are NFT-based entities that die if you don't give them away. This is the 404 page for a life form after it's died. This is what they look like when they're alive. Over 200 of them have been created. The project's been around for a couple of years, and the vast majority of them have died. So separately from sort of finding out about this MMO phenomenon, I was facing the fact that I was responsible for massive amounts of death of digital things, in this case, these digital pets. But when I started thinking about it in that SOP context, of course, the question became, how do protocols die? And I would say this is the main research question that I investigated during the fellowship. But of course, following from it, there are many sub-questions. For example, what do we mean when we refer to a protocol, video game, social media platform, mall, etc. as dead? If we call these things dead, does it mean that they lived? What is the nature of that life? What do we mean when we say they died? And finally, what can we call these things? Protocol, video game, social media platform, mall, etc., that die but are not obviously alive in the biological sense. And let's take the last one first, because it will make the whole rest of the presentation easier. I won't keep listing a bunch of things. The term that I settled on is world. And I'm using the term following Ian Cheng, who is the author of Emissary's Guide to Worlding. And this is a quote from one of his articles in the Worlding Raga series. You could say a world is something like a gated garden. A world has borders, a world has laws, a world has values, a world has dysfunction, a world can grow up, a world has members who live in it. A world manifests evidence of itself in its members, emissaries, symbols, tangible artifacts, and media, yet it is always something more. I would say it is this something more that characterizes the life of worlds. Returning to the protocol context, a world is what grows on top of a protocol when a protocol lives. Not every protocol can die because not every protocol lived in the first place. And just for a future note, all the text in these slides that has quotes but no source in the slides is just a quote from my paper. And this is a diagram of a world growing on top of a protocol, maybe over time, maybe unevenly, and maybe in a disorderly fashion. Sometimes a world that dies has something like a real funeral moment. I'm just going to play you a very short piece of this. So I hope everyone had sound for that. This is what I call, or this is a world eulogy. And what I think is so notable and very moving about it is that you can see the emotional investment that has been made by the people who are part of this world very clearly. Returning to a blockchain context or a protocol context, there are a lot of examples where we see something like these kinds of emotional investments made inside and around blockchains. So this is an example of a memorial made in 2011 to Len Sassaman, who's an open source developer, encoded in the Bitcoin blockchain. This is one of the earliest examples of this kind of thing that I could find, but it is hardly the only one. This one is to a technical contributor, I believe, who I'm not going to try to pronounce the name. I'm not sure, but this was made in Terra Nullius, which is an early proto NFT project in the Ethereum blockchain. This is a much later example, also in the Ethereum blockchain, made to Wenliang Li, the coronavirus whistleblower, and this was made in 2020. So just a few examples of this sort of emotional investment, and specifically the subject of death going on inside a blockchain. Just to look a little more at what constitutes the emotional and life of these worlds. There are sometimes things that surround the world, things that aren't actually directly in the world. For example, social media mentions, active subreddits, IRL events, meetups, conferences that might be spawned based on interest in the protocol or world. Fan fiction, fan communities, derived content, all of these things, I think, constitute life signs for a world. Protocols live through attention and they die by neglect. If I were going to characterize what constitutes the life of a protocol most simply, it would be this way. This attention leaves its most notable fingerprints in the social lives of digital worlds. There is something intangible about it, though. And this is an example that I use in the paper from a children's book, where a toy rabbit is loved so much that it becomes alive. It becomes really real. And I also use the word transubstantiation, some type of phase shift that is difficult to pinpoint, but does take place. Let's look a little more closely at what we mean when we call something dead at all in general. In the context of these worlds, we're using the word death as a metaphor. And as is often the case with other metaphors, we are revealing a truth that is difficult to articulate otherwise. Something is gone, and much like death in more familiar contexts, it cannot be recovered. It is an irreversible move from one state to another. Before beginning the SOP Fellowship, this was my mental model of life and death. Both as clearly defined categories with a discrete boundary between them. But as I looked more closely at the example through these game worlds in particular, I observed games which are still active, but also a variety of games which people are calling dead online in various circumstances, but have not really been shut down. You could still log in if you wanted to. You could still access the server. And then, there's a moment where the game is actually shut down. There is no way to log in anymore. And then also a kind of afterlife for games which had been shut down. The company that ran them had gone out of business, but there are still unofficial ways to play. Maybe a fan server that is still active. And this was my first indication that this discrete boundary might not be the right mental model. So this is the diagram that I ended up on. And it discusses all it contains all the phases we've talked about so far. including a world which is not yet fully alive. When I first create my video game, perhaps no one's played it yet. It cannot be said to have grown a world in any meaningful sense. And then the phase transition, difficult to define, but at some point, point B, we would say the world is actively alive. My game has many players. And then this whole state that is very lengthy and might take years, where the world is sometimes referred to as dead, but not possibly accessible still. A moment where the world has been shut down. And then finally, worlds which are shut down with, like I said, these secondary ways to engage, which can sometimes themselves begin the life cycle anew. This is how I described it in the paper. First, death is a process. Death is not a simple binary transition. Instead, it is a process, dying, that may result in a protracted liminal state between alive and dead. This liminal state is sometimes understood as transitional and characterized by possible disagreement or ontological uncertainty about relative liveness or deadness. The death process ends with the second key hallmark of death, as it will be discussed in this paper, death as a decision. Death is not a given, nor is it a clear natural fact. Death is instead a decision similar to a diagnosis, with domain-specific criteria determined by technology, authority, and culture. We can further separate death as a decision into cases where the world has a clear decision maker, such as an MMO. I've talked about those a lot so far in this talk, and cases where there is not, such as a peer-to-peer protocol. This is another diagram, which is actually a little bit light, but it shows this dying phase. There's a dotted line here around the phase where the green color is fading out gradually, resulting in this pinpointed moment where some authority with the ability to make a death decision has made it. So here's my joke. Besides, engaging in a complicated health protocol designed to preserve the actual body for an indefinite period of time, another way to not die would be to transition to a cosmological system where the self is not in the body and the death of the self happens at a theoretically infinite later date in the future. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean. Through a discussion of some of these liminal states between life and death. I got quite obsessed with these during the research fellowship, and I discovered a number of different forms that we can observe them. So just for clarity, that's sort of zooming in here on these worlds which are referred to as dead but haven't been fully shut down. Turning first to human death, I had this impulse that looking at death processes and decisions in the context of humans might reveal something about how it works in the context of these intangible things that we're calling here worlds. In the late 1800s, diagnosing death was considered medically difficult, with some doctors insisting that the only inarguable or sure marker of death was the beginning of putrefaction. And this was reflected through widespread panic about being buried alive. So this is a historical book about preventing premature burial. You can read some very scary statistics about how often this happened. And absolutely fun fact, it actually almost happened to one of my historical relatives. Apparently in the town where they lived, there was a shortage of coffins. One of these people this person had had a respiratory illness and appeared to not be breathing. But because of the shortage of coffins, couldn't be buried for some days. and then, coughed themselves back into liveliness just a few days later. And presumably was breathing the whole time imperceptibly. So apocryphal, but real thing my grandma says at dinner. Besides this, though, as medical technology advanced over the 19th century, there were more and more precise ways that doctors would diagnose death. They developed ways to detect the electrocurrent of the heart, for example. And so for a long time in the 20th century, the death of the body was pinpointed when the heart stopped. And then even farther down the development of medical technology, it became possible to diagnose brain death separately from and before other physical systems stopped. And brain death is interesting also because with current medical technology, the body can continue to breathe and the heart can continue to beat while it is in a brain dead state, actually for years. And yet, even with contemporary technology and its unprecedented access to the body, clear consensus around brain death as legitimate death, as death of the thing that we call a person, are not global universals. This was a text that I read pretty thoroughly and found very helpful for my thinking on this. And it contrasts the medical practices around brain death in the United States and in Japan, because they are very similar in one hand, and that is that they both have very widespread access to advanced medical technology, and they share the same concept of brain death. So Japanese neurologists concur about the irreversibility of brain death, and the vast majority of them are convinced that they can diagnose it reliably. But there are very different opinions about whether brain death constitutes the death of the person in both places. Where is the self in the body? So despite sharing the same medical definition as the United States, in Japan, many doctors are reluctant to cooperate with organ procurement processes. And some hesitate to encourage relatives to think of brain dead patients as dead. So organ transplants are very hard evidence for the differing ontology of death in these places. Because organ donation relies on social legal consensus that a person with brain death is actually dead, so we can take their organs and give them to somebody else to save their life. In the United States, the number of deceased organ donors per million is 36.8. In Japan, it's 0.99. So there are different decision-making processes and ideas about what exactly is dying when, operating in both of these places. Another example, I've just lost my slides, there we go, are the concept of legal death or being presumed dead. So in the United States, a person cannot be presumed dead or declared dead, sometimes for up to 7 years. In other jurisdictions, it can take as long as 10. In this intermediary period, while a missing or absent person is likely dead, they are still legally alive. Their beneficiaries cannot collect life insurance and their estate cannot be administered. So this is surprisingly widespread. It's estimated there are between 60,000 and 100,000 people in this legal liminal state in the United States alone. Another example that I looked at is anthropological contexts and sort of spiritual treatments of death. So this is the rite of passage framework proposed by ethnographer Arnold van Gennep in 1909. And he applied this framework to a number of situations: pregnancy, childbirth, initiation, marriage, and of course, funerals. A rite of passage is a set of rituals moving from one state to another with three phases: a separation from state one, a period of liminality, an incorporation into the new reality, and then, of course, we are in state two. This is another source I found very interesting. It has a lengthy section on cultures where there is secondary processing. So this is a person's body dies, but there are a series of rituals, events, or processes and practices undertaken before the person can actually be conceived of as dead. That might be, for example, kinds of care being taken of the corpse, but it might also be food being offered, things like that. And in some places, this process can take as long as several years. So in this book, they focus on Indonesia, where many people conceive of a period where the mortal is neither fully alive nor finally dead. But they also describe examples of secondary processing found in Central Asia, North and South America, Melanesia, and Greece. And to summarize that, or to highlight secondary processing, may seem like an edge case, but it also bears some connection to concepts like Christian purgatory, which is an intermediary place where the soul goes after death to undergo final penance, or embalming, which is widespread in North America as a way to extend the period before burial that a body can be stored for. So in a variety of contexts, we see death as a process, culminating in a kind of decision with a liminal state in between the beginning of this process and the final point at which we can say it's concluded from a variety of perspectives. Be that a medical definition of death that has changed at different points in history and remains different in different medical systems, in the legal concept of death, in various religious protocols, death and funerary rituals. And also, I don't have slides about these in particular, but there is a concept of social death, which originated as a term describing slavery. The process that a slave goes through when entering it is a kind of death. They lose their ability to make commitments and have social relationships as they would have otherwise. The term has since been used in a variety of other contexts where we can think of someone as undergoing a kind of death, socially speaking, while their body is still alive. And a very related concept of second loss, which is a much newer described phenomenon where someone's body has died, but their online presence continues to exist. Data related to them continues to be accessible for a period of time and is then lost, almost like they die a second time. And of course, related to a lot of these things are newer proposals like AI avatars allowing us to talk to dead relatives, this kind of thing. So I bring up all of these examples to reveal the decision-making practices around death and provide edge cases for thinking about what it is exactly that dies: a body, a legal entity, a social being, etc. And I think once we name death as a kind of decision, the lights come on and we see the puppet strings. who has been given authority to decide that something is dead, and what rituals or protocols are undertaken to cement its deadness. In the human context, it is doctors, lawyers, and sometimes religious figures. In the context of worlds like games or social media platforms, it is a company or organization. In more decentralized worlds, like protocols, fandoms, etc., there may be no clear decision maker, and this introduces a fundamental anxiety. I also want to highlight that the governance process itself that is undertaking a death decision, or the person, or the social entity like a medical system, is independent from the fact that a decision is undertaken. This process could be anything as long as it is capable of facing this existential question. To look a little more closely at some examples of decentralized things that do not have a clear decision maker, but do nonetheless sometimes die or are certainly referred to as dead. People make lists of dead blockchains. This is one of them. There are similar lists maintained by Coinopsy and CoinMarketCap. And this one we can see has death indicators. So this is just the first 3 on the list. There are more than 1,000. And the death indicators given are things like inactive Twitter, not listed on exchanges, not indexed, low trading volume, etc. Something missing from most of these blockchain-based lists that I wanted to return to this diagram from earlier in the slides to talk about is all of these places that aren't necessarily strictly speaking within the protocol, but are important life indicators. The list we just showed looked at Twitter, but it really only looks at the Twitter of the blockchain itself, not the mentions by others on social media, for example. I think that activity related to the blockchain or protocol that is not, strictly speaking, financial or coming from the foundation or organization that manages it itself is a really important and overlooked life indicator. And in the paper, I proposed a sort of science fiction proposition, maybe, of an order of protocological death. Already the observed death indicators from the dead coins lists are like a doctor inspecting first for an absence of swallow reflex, then for no eye response to light, no low limb movement on painful stimulus, etc. Looking for a list of symptoms. Death in a medical context is a diagnosis. In Twice Dead, Margaret and Locke writes, decentralists usually argue that because different parts of the body stop functioning and die at different times, death must be a process. And I think perhaps the word decentralists here is interesting and significant. The body does not die all at once, nor does a blockchain or protocol. We look at different symptoms or indicators and eventually reach a diagnosis of death. I felt very vindicated when I was Googling dead blockchains, putting these slides together, because actually just this May, this article came out describing the phenomenon too, and it wasn't out during the research fellowship. And here's a quote from it. Says one venture capitalist who requested anonymity, "There's no wind down process for a dead crypto protocol." Is that a problem though? Why is it dangerous to forget death or leave these protocols to linger indefinitely as though they were still alive? One reason most applicable perhaps in the human context, but I think also in the context of some worlds where people have made significant emotional investments. One of the important functions funeral rituals can serve is reconstituting society without the lost member. The various social roles of the dead person must be taken over by others or changed. When there is an incomplete funeral moment, it can impede the grief process. This is from some commentary on the article that I found from just this May. The problem is not only that all this makes the broader crypto industry look dodgy, it's also that dead blockchains take resources and attention away from crypto ventures that are getting some traction or building something useful. The question is whether anything can be done about this. The best option might be for respected players in the crypto space, including those from the VC and analyst sector, to follow Forbes's example and publish lists that show which blockchains are truly dead in the water. So I see this almost as an independently created proposal for something like an order of protocological death in the context of crypto. Also in the context of crypto, an example that I looked at that Venkat already mentioned a little bit in the introduction, and I think could be looked at further very usefully, is that of the difficulty bomb in Ethereum. So this was introduced while the chain was proof of work as an incentive for developers to make the switch to proof of stake. It would make mining impossible after a certain point if it were to go off. And I think it's also sort of interesting to ask what this sort of confrontation with death, or maybe protocological memento mori, did for and around the development of Ethereum. For example, was it useful for aligning economic incentives during a very important growth phase? Could the requirements of the difficulty bomb have had the secondary effect of more robust governance or a reduced tendency towards ossification? What rate of updates to a protocol lead to greater long-term health? Are more updates required in the early stages as it seeks adoption, as it tries to grow a world? And then at some point, the frequency of updates is no longer needed. Perhaps I think this is the hypothesis being made by some advocates for ossification. Okay. So also, an understanding of mortality or ephemerality of data allows efforts to be better directed towards preservation, archiving, and memorialization. Digital things uniquely present the fantasy of the infinite perfect archive. For example, we can easily imagine saving the entire game map of the video game that might be shutting down. However, this is from a report called the Preserving Virtual Worlds report, which uses Second Life as a case study for game archiving. And it says, an important part of the historical context for virtual world history is the fact that human beings, through their avatars, fill these digital environments with meaning that emerges from their activities in social spaces, regardless of whether the spaces are synthetic, digital, or physical. If we save every bit of a virtual world, its software, and the data associated with it and stored on its servers, it may still be the case that we have completely lost the history. You can imagine if you started up an MMO and join it from this archived map, and there are no other players to interact with there, you have not meaningfully got the game as it once existed. That is unrecoverable from what you have. That is specifically what died. And you can also imagine, even if you had every save state from the game throughout its entire existence without the sort of player population engaging actively, again, you would still have lost something meaningful. And so I'll close with this question. What kind of archive, cemetery, or memorial is appropriate for dead worlds? Which is the question that I spend much of the second half of the paper dealing with in various forms through examples of attempts that have been made with various successes and failures. And this image, by the way, is from the bunnies of Second Life, which were digital pets in the game Second Life, which sadly all died one day because of a copyright dispute between the person who created them and another company. So to find out more about this question, you will have to read my SOP paper, which I believe is in copy editing phase, and I believe will be available very soon. So thank you for listening. I think we still have a bit of time for questions or discussion if there are any.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that insight into your Summer of Protocols research. Do we have some questions or comments from either you two or from those of you that are backstage here in the StreamYard? Venka is requesting that we bring all SOP 23 people into the show here. So if you are in the backstage area, I will be adding you in one moment. So get yourself to be presentable and ideally turn your cameras on.
Oh, I'm reading the chat and I see you didn't have audio for my video share. Well, you missed a very emotional speech from a player of that game, but it is on YouTube. So
I did share the link right after it came through, so hopefully people can see it.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, I thought it would be funny to bring whoever is available on for a funeral shot, since this is the last of the SOP 23 talks.
Wow. Is someone screen capping? Someone better be screen capping.
Well, we'll have the whole video, but yeah, screen cap is a second order death as well, since it'll be a static version of a dynamic image.
Towards the end of the paper, I say that a memorial is a kind of compression technology. So a screen cap is very effective. We can use a screen cap as a memorial of this talk series without having to watch any talks.
And just a thought, your idea of like the extended liminal phase, this last talk is the beginning of death, but the end of the death process will be when the last piece is actually published in the kit. So it's kind of going to be, I think, a 4 to 5 month death process here.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, you got me thinking about Killed by Google, which lists all of the Google products that have been euthanized by the company. But I guess none of them died on their own. They were all taken out back beyond the woodshed.
I mean, I think that would be the case where there's a clear decider here, Google. Like a lot of these MMO examples I looked at are run by a company. They've never, exited to community. So it's kind of when a company shuts down or is sold And it's a very clear process compared to what we might talk about with something like a blockchain or protocol.
I wanted to bring up a theme that came up in the comments. Shino mentioned how much life is still left in a tree stump after the tree is cut down. And Shuya, in her Exit to Protocol essay, she had this metaphor of a whale fall as a sort of like ecosystem generating event where the dead whale becomes the source of a lot of new life, right? So have you thought much about that? Like how death is kind of an essential part of like creating a new burst of life or something?
Well, I definitely found examples where, one of these sort of afterlife-like spaces that continues to exist after one world has died takes on a life of its own and could be said to exist independently or separately. So that would be like a really clear example of that would be like fan servers, like in a game that has been shut down. Some of them were really loved, and many fan servers are around. So definitely examples like this. I think also, this is related a bit to the clearing up space and resources that are consumed by something that is maybe unhealthy in some way. And the example from the talk here would be that is most relevant to this scenario would be the blockchain that is still capturing a bunch of media attention when it has no users and no developers, and indeed has a lot of capital tied up in it, which could perhaps also be used better elsewhere.
I think there's a distinction to be made here between the idea of an afterlife, which is people with some sort of like continuity and connection to the original thing that's dying. So like, fan servers versus people who either have no relation or perhaps even an adversarial relation using the sort of like freed up resources to do new things. And the latter is kind of what you see a lot of in Silicon Valley, right? There's the notion of an eBay mafia, or sorry, PayPal mafia, which is all these like great entrepreneurs who came out of PayPal once their stocks options vested and they suddenly became newly wealthy. And then PayPal was a crappy company that was not dying necessarily, but had too much capital locked up. But all these people who became newly rich then founded a whole new generation of internet companies, right? So that's not so much afterlife so much as a new generation of life enabled by, like, I don't know, cutting out the deadness in the old thing, which is still alive. PayPal is still alive.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to use the whale metaphor, like the afterlife of the whale versus those things that feed on the nutrients that were once in the whale's body.
I have a comment from Day in the YouTube chat that says, is thinking about comment deletion protocols. Who decides? The author, the recipient, each for themselves. What happens with orphaned responses? Comment threads are in some sense very small worlds.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. And I think definitely commenting all of these questions, for who decides what happens in these cases are also protocol logical questions. And I guess I would just add, or if this subject is interesting, one of the things in my paper is a look at 4chan threads, actually, because they are pretty interesting in their mechanics. Namely, a 4chan thread average time for existing is perhaps only a minute. And the community evolves protocols for keeping threads online, for curating within these protocols, but also, just in terms of disappearing data and how that's dealt with on a platform. it's a very unusual version of comment implementation.
Other questions or comments from those of you here in the video or on YouTube? Dorian, go ahead.
Yeah, Sarah, it occurred to me, did you get a sense of the like proportion of MMOs that did exit to community or like could do fan servers versus the ones that were like completely tethered to a company that like either shut it down and then went on to do other things, or like the company itself just went and imploded? Like, did you get a sense of the breakdown of that, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely don't have something that I would trust in terms of data in this direction. Might be a good question for Seth, who was also in our program, who worked on a game that died, and actually did end up releasing a open source version for the community, as sort of part of the. It was very interesting because he described releasing that open version for the community as what made the death of the game feel like a good death, when it previously had not. Many of the games that I looked at did have some type of fan server existing, but I absolutely don't have data about it. It would be very interesting. The classic exit to community version that we might talk about in crypto, though, where it transitions actually to be sort of owned by the community, I actually can't think of an example where I found that playing out in quite the way people usually mean it.
Interesting.
Eric, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Mhm.
Sweet. So I kind of got thinking about preservation attempts for dead languages as an interesting analogy to sort of the ability to store in a code base a set of digital objects and worlds that are fundamentally inert in some way, but might well be resuscitated given enough effort on the part of anyone motivated to do so, in the face of, like they encounter, say, the library records of a dead indigenous language, including recordings with the last known living speakers of them. There's theoretically the possibility of bringing that language back to life, just as you can sort of resuscitate a digital world. And this made me kind of think of the spanning the material and digital in interesting ways, like the ways that Bitcoin maxis like to preserve their, key strings or seed phrases in very material objects to ensure against any like possibility of true digital erasure. To me, there's interesting overlaps in terms of this inherent liminality of death when it comes to certain like language or code-based artifacts. Just wondering if you have any thoughts in response to that.
Yeah, definitely great examples. I remember, or I'm thinking about how much so many of us during SOP1 cohort talked about whether language was a protocol. I think often settling on yes. And I think whether a language is a world, I mean, maybe we could invert it, right? Can we have a world without language? I don't know. And I think that in the example of a dead language, it is, it could absolutely be relearned from preserved artifacts from when it was last spoken. I think that would not be bringing back what was lost, and likely, if a theoretical alien time traveling linguist had access to the formerly alive version and the reincarnated version, I suspect they would find interesting differences, though, we will have to leave that to the time travelers of the future to ascertain. But on the subject of code artifacts, one example that I looked at or thought about a fair bit is the Arctic World Archive, which is this like extremely funny building in the Arctic permafrost where at one point all of the code on GitHub was put on these disks made of special material to last forever. And forever is always a nebulous term, but and I found it very funny impulse, and maybe exactly an example of someone who's saved the map and thinks they have the thing that mattered. Because on GitHub, for example, the entire software that it's based on, Git, is for keeping track of different version changes, different branches, different contributions made by different people, and perhaps even the debates that they are having about those versions. Whereas the Arctic World Archive just has the sort of one flash moment of the code at one point. So I would say that, really very little about what lives in an open source project, or very few of the meaningful questions a historian might have about why it exists, or what people did with it, or what did the community care about, agree about, or disagree about. Those are not sort of meaningfully kept in that archive. So yeah, I thought about both of these examples, and I only took on the second one in a very small way. Someone should do or I feel like there would be a very interesting protocological perspective paper about language, birth, life cycle, and death.
Thank you.
Any other last minute thoughts or questions for Sarah on her research from Summer Protocols 23? Question from Ananth in YouTube. What's the relationship between hardness and death? It seems hardness could cause protocols to evolve into zombies rather than having a good death. Are there good examples outside of computer contexts?
This is a good question. I think it's related to the question that I brought up in specifically the context of the difficulty bomb and protocol changes being made perhaps best at different phases in the protocol lifecycle. Are there different rates of change that allow for a longer protocol health span? I do think that a protocol can die through too much hardness. One of the artifacts that I worked on as a addendum to the main paper is a list of possible protocological deaths. Though I think specifically looking at which ones are most dangerous or which forms of death are most common is not something that I got to in the short research fellowship. I also considered examples like of a very base layer internet protocol, like, for example, TCP/IP. I'm not sure that TCP/IP has an active world around it the way something like Ethereum does, perhaps much less so, because it's not thought about as often, even by people who use it. And I think there are probably many more examples of protocols, computer languages, even farther sort of into the world of passing out of active memory that are still dependent on as some sort of base layer. Protocols have a sort of substrates to them, I feel. A protocol can be built on top of another protocol, and all the way up and down, and we do talk about the stack in software development. Okay, I've just rambled. But then the question is a base protocol here that is no longer the recipient of active attention? We might say its world is fading, in danger necessarily if it has many things using it as a substrate. And I don't quite know. I think it's an interesting question. I'm not sure if this is helpful to you directly. Are there good examples outside of computer contexts? I will admit that every single example that I used just there was a computer-related one. Though that probably says more about my background than the possibility space.
You got me thinking, Sarah, there just about how TCP/IP is almost at a mature enough state that there are kind of like rituals around implementing it, and you're only ever going to implement it in like a new operating system. And so like, and you're only ever going to revisit that code if there's like a bug. And it's kind of like how Knuth's tech system is he's adds a digit to pi. It's like 3.1 something whatever, and he adds a digit to pi with every and with the implication that as a piece of software it's getting asymptotically more refined, but as far as its behavior is concerned, it's fixed. And it's almost like a jewel or a sculpture or a monument or something like that, in contrast to like other software systems that are very much in flux and people are constantly tinkering with them. I don't know. You just sort of got me thinking about these differing natures of how people view a piece of software, and I would imagine TCP/IP is sort of like driving towards this almost a fixed state, on contrast to say HTTP, which seems to be getting reincarnated, and it's been sort of like reincarnated with identical semantics and completely different syntax twice already. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's I think these are all really interesting examples of protocols with different kinds of hardness around them. I think also HTTP is a protocol that is much more in mind for many people. And I think that, I'm not sure there's like fan fiction about HTTP. Someone should maybe write that, but it's known about, and I wonder, yeah, well, what conclusions we might draw in terms of its aliveness or deadness. I also did not really undertake to create my own specific definitional criteria for when categories of protocols live and die. I think that would be interesting work that could be done. But I think that, first you need a sort of taxonomic effort for different kinds of protocols. And then you need probably an analysis per each kind. I think so. I think I imagined it as being somewhat out of scope of the short work in general, and I thought more about the broad pattern overall. But it would be very interesting to do with more specific examples or narrowing down perhaps to internet communication and networking protocols.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for the conversation today, and Sarah, again, for our final researcher salon from the 23 cohort.
Thank you also. Thank you for listening, everyone. Thank you for your comments and questions. Thank you to everyone from SOP1. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. And we'll see you all next week for a chat with Daniel Bashir. All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.